Welcome to Security Gateway Technical Training. In this webinar, we'll talk about Security Gateway's key features, including real-time spam protection, anti-spoofing tools such as DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, anti-abuse tools such as dynamic screening and account hijack detection. Security Gateway can help protect against false positives. It offers encryption using the secure messaging portal as well as additional email encryption services, plus your industry standard SSL and TLS encryption, and SSL and TLS extensions such as Start TLS and Require TLS, which we'll talk about throughout this presentation. Security Gateway includes block lists and allow lists. And these block lists and allow lists can be controlled by administrators as well as for end users themselves. Security Gateway offers archiving and compliance features, including retention policies and legal hold. It includes fine-tuning of security settings, meaning that throughout Security Gateway, Security Gateway's security features can be fine-tuned for granular control over your security and mail flow processes. It offers convenient web access through your browser. Security Gateway includes its own built-in web server, or you can use an IIS or another third-party web server or an external web server if you'd like to use that instead. Security Gateway includes graphical charts and reports for visual representation of mail traffic activity, and message logs with color-coded transcripts for easy troubleshooting of mail delivery issues. The backbone of Security Gateway's security features is based on the Civ email filtering language. Security Gateway has a variety of what we call Civ scripts that Security Gateway's security processes are based on, and you can create your own Civ scripts, which I can show you as well. Security Gateway offers external threat protection as well as protection from internal threats. When protecting from external threats, Security Gateway uses a variety of anti-spam features, antivirus, anti-abuse, anti-spoofing features, all the features that you see listed here. So for example, here is Stick and Bayesian, DNS and URI block lists, gray listing, backscatter protection, message scoring. Security Gateway includes two antivirus engines, Icarus and Clam AV, as well as zero-hour outbreak protection, anti-spoofing features like reverse lookups, callback verification, and email authentication features such as DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, anti-abuse features, relay controls, IP shielding, which is a feature that allows you to designate an IP address or range of IP addresses that an email must have come from if it claims to come from a particular domain. We'll talk about IP shielding in a little bit more detail later on. It also offers location screening to block inbound connections or inbound emails from countries that you do not do business with, as well as a content filter that you can configure with custom rules, attachment filtering based on attachment type, as well as block lists and allow lists. On the outbound side, Security Gateway offers data leak prevention to protect your business from leaks of confidential data perpetrated via email. Of course, SSL and TLS encryption. And because Security Gateway uses a web-based interface, non-secure HTTP connections can be redirected to secure HTTPS connections. So let's talk about deploying Security Gateway. When you're considering deploying Security Gateway to protect your mail server, you want to consider a few things. For example, where will Security Gateway be installed? Will it be installed on its own dedicated server, which is the most straightforward way to do it? Or if you want to install Security Gateway on the mail server itself, that's possible as well. Then you want to determine how accounts will be added in Security Gateway. Accounts can be added automatically by querying what we call a user verification source, such as a Microsoft Exchange server with Active Directory, Office 365, an LDAP database, or you can add accounts manually. Also, when deploying Security Gateway, make sure that your DNS records properly point to Security Gateway. So for inbound email to reach Security Gateway, your MX record needs to be updated to associate your domain with the IP address or hostname of the server that Security Gateway is installed on. Update as well any PTR records or any A records accordingly. And then on the outbound side, you'll want to configure your mail server to send all outbound mail through Security Gateway. In other words, configure your mail server to use Security Gateway as a smart host. So when you're deploying Security Gateway sits between the public-facing internet and your mail server. So when inbound mail comes in, it goes through your router. It first reaches Security Gateway where email is filtered or scanned accordingly, and then messages that have been cleared or clean can be passed on to your mail server, whether that be a Microsoft Exchange, Office 365, MDaemon, or any other type of mail server. Like I mentioned, the most straightforward way to install Security Gateway or to deploy Security Gateway is to install it on its own dedicated server. That way, you don't have to make any changes to the SMTP ports. In this example, I'm using port 25, but you can also use, for example, the SSL SMTP port, and the configuration follows the same concept. Because Security Gateway and the mail server, in this case Exchange, are on their own dedicated servers, you don't have to make any changes to the SMTP port. They can both listen in on the dedicated standard SMTP port. Now, if you do decide to install Security Gateway on the mail server itself, then what we want to avoid is a port conflict. And the easiest way to do that is to change the SMTP port that the mail server is listening on to a different port, such as port 26, and then have your users configure their mail clients to connect to that mail server on that new port, in this case, port 26. And then on the outbound side, you can configure your mail server to send to Security Gateway, basically to itself or localhost, but send it to the mail server on port 25. The process for installing Security Gateway is pretty straightforward. You can download a 30-day fully functional free trial of Security Gateway on our website at mdamon.com. And when you download the installer file, you simply double-click on it to run the installation. And then on the screen that you see here, simply click on Next. Basically, this is the welcome screen. Be sure to click I agree on the end user license agreement. Select your destination directory. By default, Security Gateway is installed under the C Program Files MDamon Technologies directory, but you can install Security Gateway in a different path if you'd like to do so. Security Gateway includes its own embedded Firebird database. However, if you have an existing Firebird database that you'd like to use or an existing Firebird database server, you can select the second option and then fill in the information here to use your own Firebird database. The next step is to enter your registration key. If you want to use the 30-day free trial of Security Gateway, then select the first option to install the free trial. When you do that, the following screens will ask you for your contact information as well as a valid email address. That email address is where your trial key will be emailed. So you'll want to check your email for that trial key, and then you can enter that trial key here if you don't already have a purchased registration key. And then click on Next. And on the following screen, we are now ready to install. So we click on Next, and as you can see, I have a progress bar here at the bottom indicating that your files are being copied over. Once the installation has run, it's going to ask you for your domain, and it's going to ask you how you want Security Gateway to add or validate users. So Security Gateway doesn't just automatically accept mail for an account that it's not aware of. It has to first determine if the account is valid on the mail server. Now, in this particular case, I have Security Gateway installed in front of an mdamon mail server, so I'm using the mdamon using Minger user verification method. But as you can see here, you can choose to enter accounts manually. You can use an SMTP call forward verification. You can query an Active Directory or Microsoft Exchange server or an LDAP server. And you can also, by the way, query a Microsoft 365 data source as well. And then after you click Next, the following screen will ask you to enter your mail server information. So you give it a description and then enter the host name or IP address of your mail server, as well as the SMTP port that the mail server is listening on. If that mail server requires SMTP authentication, be sure to enter a valid username and password as shown here, and then click on Next. And then the administrator account will need to be set up. So this can be a local user or an external user that's not necessarily a member of any of your local domains. In this particular case, I'm choosing to use the local user option, where you can then enter the full name, mailbox name, not including the @ symbol or the domain, by the way. So frank.thomas, for example, I have an email address, frank.thomas@example.com. So we just put the frank.thomas in the blank, and then enter and verify a password that you want to use for the administrator account, and then click on Next. And then confirm the ports that Security Gateway is listening on. So your SMTP port, your dedicated SSL SMTP port, the MSA port or Message Submission Agent port, which also uses an encrypted connection. And again, keep in mind right here, if you are running Security Gateway and your mail server on the same server and your mail server is listening in on port 26, be sure and change the SMTP port here to port 26 and then click on Next. And then we enter the host name and the ports that are used by Security Gateway's web interface. This is going to be the URL that you use to log into Security Gateway. So in this example, for example, I have sg.example.com. And as you can see, the default ports are 4000 and 4443. So again, that's going to be the URL that you use to log into the Security Gateway interface. And then if you leave the box checked to start Security Gateway, you can then hit Finish to begin using Security Gateway. Again, when logging into Security Gateway, the default URL would be, for example, the host name of the Security Gateway mail server, and then the port. So if it's running on port 4000 or listening in on port 4000, then hostname :4000. Or if you're using an HTTPS secure connection, it will listen in on port 4443 for login connections. So you would be able to enter your domain :4443. Of course, there are other variations as well, depending on if you have, say, for example, your proper DNS records configured to allow just, say, for example, sg.example.com. And that would be, for example, your what we call a CNAME record that allows you to associate a different URL that points to the IP address of the Security Gateway server. And this is what the Security Gateway dashboard looks like when you first log into Security Gateway. As you can see, you have some statistical information on the left-hand side, any currently active sessions that are running, inbound and outbound sessions, how many days left on your registration key. In this case, for example, I have a trial key, so I have 365 days remaining. The status of the various different mail queues, your inbound queue, delivery queue, your bad messages queue, administrative quarantine, and your user quarantine queues. As you can see, toward the bottom left, I have over 6,000 messages in each of those queues. You can view the various different mail queues. You can freeze the inbound or delivery queue, which might be useful if you needed to troubleshoot mail delivery issues. For example, if you freezed a mail queue and then had somebody send a test email, pull that email message up as it's sitting in that currently frozen queue to view the message headers, and then unfreeze the queue and view the headers again to see if any alterations are taking place on message headers. That's just one of several scenarios in which you might want to freeze the Security Gateway mail queues. On the right-hand side under Server Performance, you can see how much disk space you have left and what level of resources are being taken up by Security Gateway's processes. So System, Security Gateway, the Icarus and Clam, AV, antivirus engines, as well as the Security Gateway Spam Daemon or SG-SPAMD services as shown here. Also, scrolling down on the dashboard, you have various charts and graphs that show you at a glance inbound and outbound email activity. So for example, inbound versus outbound messages, total bandwidth used by email, good versus junk messages, a breakdown of the different types of junk email messages. And each one of these charts and graphs, as you can see, they have all these data points that correspond to the hours of the day. You can hover your mouse over a data point to view the statistics for that particular data point, or click on a data point to view the inbound and outbound messages that correspond to that particular data point. So for example, let me pull up my live Security Gateway server, and I'll show you a better example of what that looks like. So here's the dashboard. Here's my dashboard. Here is now your charts and graphs can be resized depending on how large your window is. So as you can see here, for example, here are my inbound versus outbound messages. You can hover your mouse over a data point. For example, at 5 p.m., you can see here that 440 total messages were sent, 233 inbound messages, and 207 outbound messages. I can click on that data point, and it'll take me to all of the messages corresponding to that particular data point. You have total bandwidth used by email, good versus junk messages, a breakdown of the different types of junk email messages that were filtered out, for example, spam, virus, spoofing, abuse, incomplete, and user. And by the way, you can turn various elements of these charts on and off by simply clicking the buttons as shown here. You have a chart for total email recipients, and again, hovering your mouse gives you the number of messages corresponding to that particular user. For example, Frank Thomas has 1,436 emails. Top spam sources, and then you can also create custom charts and graphs. I've created a custom chart called Top 5 Reasons to Block Emails. And if you wanted to create a custom chart, you can click on this button and select Customize Charts. And you can create a new custom chart by clicking this button here. You can choose whether to select messages or bandwidth, or you can choose show the top X number of Y properties, for example, from the following table. So for example, messages, and let's say the top 10 reasons, for example, and then hit continue. I'm just going to call this top 10 reasons. Hit continue. And for my time span, I'm going to choose the last 48 hours. We'll hit continue. And then these are what your charts will look like. You can choose what you would like it to look like. I'm going to use a bar chart in this case. Click on Continue. And then we hit Create the Chart. And if I scroll down, this is our new custom chart. So you can get pretty creative with these custom charts and graphs. So I'm going to close this out, and we'll go back to our slideshow. So now back on our slideshow, this is just reiterating what I was just talking about regarding the custom dashboard reports. You can see again here the different criteria that you can include in your custom report. And again, here's an example of my custom reports that we just discussed. Now, Security Gateway needs to know where the mail server is that Security Gateway is protecting. Of course, like I mentioned, when we installed Security Gateway, we were already able to enter that information. However, if you wanted to add an additional mail server to be protected by Security Gateway, you can certainly do so under the Setup Users menu under Mail Configuration. See where it says Domain Mail Servers right here. And then you can click on the new button to add your new mail server, but Security Gateway can protect multiple mail servers. And when you're adding a mail server, you'll want to give it a description, enter the host name or IP address, the port that the mail server is listening on, whether or not it requires that SMTP authentication, and if so, the username and password that will be used for authentication. And as you can see at the bottom, you can see which domains are being used by this particular mail server. If no domain is selected for a particular mail server, you can check the box to indicate that this particular mail server is a default mail server in which, when a domain has not been specified, the default mail server will be used. Now let's talk about adding users in Security Gateway. Now, as I mentioned, users can be added automatically by querying Active Directory, mdaemon using Minger, or another user verification source, or you can add users manually. To add users manually, we can go to the Accounts menu, select Domains and Users as shown here. Click on the number of users. As you can see, I currently have 11 users for my example.com domain. And then on the user list page, we can select the new button to add a new user, and then simply enter in the account information, the mailbox name, the portion in front of the domain, the real name. And you don't necessarily need to enter a password when you're adding a user in Security Gateway because user passwords are verified against a user verification source like mdaemon using Minger, Active Directory, and so forth. And you can also specify toward the bottom whether or not this user is an administrator. And it can be a global administrator or a domain administrator where they are allowed to configure changes and settings for their specific domain. As I mentioned, you can use user verification sources in Security Gateway to add users automatically. If you go this route, select user verification sources, and then when you're entering a new user verification sources, these are the options you have to choose from. For example, let's say you want to verify users against an Office 365. You have capability of doing that here. Now let's talk about spam filter settings in Security Gateway. Security Gateway uses industry standard Spam Assassin, so if you're familiar with that, there are lots of resources out there on the internet for, let's say for if you're a power user, spamassassin.org I believe is their main website. So if you're familiar with Spam Assassin, you may be familiar with many of Spam Assassin's rules and various configuration files. But as you can see here, this is the spam filter settings configuration screen. Looking on the bottom left side, under the Security Anti-Spam menu, when we select Heuristics and Bayesian, that's your primary spam filtering process, the checkbox on the bottom are what are used to enable the spam filter. So let's move here to the top right-hand side. You can check the box to use heuristic rules and Bayesian classification to analyze messages. That's going to enable your basic spam filtering processes. You can add the score that Spam Assassin returns to the actual message score, and then choose your quarantine and rejection thresholds based on the Spam Assassin score, at which point the message is quarantined or rejected by Security Gateway. And you can, of course, configure exclusions, so messages larger than a certain size, messages from allow listed senders or authenticated sessions, or messages from your own domain mail servers. If your users are receiving more spam than usual, or any spam at all that's above a minimum threshold, you can make your spam scoring more aggressive by lowering these rejection and quarantine threshold values shown here in the upper right-hand side. And under the anti-spam menu, if you select message scoring in the next level of navigation down, this is going to give you options for enabling actions based on final message scoring. Now, this takes into consideration the scoring values that are added by other security features in Security Gateway, not just the spam filter and Spam Assassin. So when a message is scanned by Security Gateway and it passes through the various security processes, those individual processes can adjust the scoring value for that particular process. And at the end, a cumulative score is assessed, and that score is compared to the values we have in the blanks shown here. These are the values where you can reject or quarantine messages based on their final scoring value. And again, this includes scoring values that are added by a variety of security features, not just the spam filter and spam assassin. Security Gateway includes outbreak protection, which is a technology that can detect spam and virus outbreaks, often within minutes of them being released on the internet, and long before any traditional antivirus software has been updated with the proper antivirus definitions to catch these emerging threats. So if an inbound message is determined to be part of a spam or virus outbreak, using the options shown here, you can choose what to do with that message. You can refuse the message, quarantine the message, or accept the message and tag the message subject with a series of characters, which if you do that, you can use your mail server's content filter to look for that tag and then filter it accordingly. You can also optionally add a given number of points to the message's score. This is what I was talking about on a previous slide where I mentioned the cumulative scoring value that you can reject or quarantine based on. This is one of those features that can be configured to modify that score. Now notice in the upper right hand corner we have where it says for domain and it says global. There are a lot of security features in Security Gateway where you can customize various settings on a per domain basis using the for domain drop-down menu, or you can configure those settings globally. There's a feature we have called Bayesian classification, which is basically artificial intelligence to train the spam filter to become more accurate over time by feeding it samples of spam and non-spam messages. To configure Bayesian classification, on the bottom where it says click here to configure SG-SPAMD, we'll click on that link, and then these are your Bayesian classification settings. So of course we'll check the box at the top left to enable the Bayesian classification feature. Notice, by the way, slightly below that, you have thresholds where you can specify the number of messages that are required before non-spam and spam messages are learned. In other words, the default is 200 messages. In other words, you'll want to feed it 200 samples of spam and 200 samples of non-spam messages. These samples are broken apart into the various different components, or what we call tokens, and fed into what we call a database, a database of spam-like and non-spam-like tokens or snippets of information to help Security Gateway recognize spam and non-spam. And you can schedule Bayesian learning to take place at regular intervals, say for example every night at midnight, every 4 hours, whatever interval that you'd like to specify. You can also enter the path where known spam and known non-spam messages are stored. And you can configure a spam and non-spam forwarding address, so spamlearn or hamlearn at example.com. To use those addresses, if a user receives a spam message, for example, that they want to send it to the spam forwarding address, they could send that message as an attachment, not just forward it, but actually attach it to an email message and send it to spamlearn at example.com, spamlearn at whatever your domain is, for example. And that will help train the spam filter by feeding it to Security Gateway's Bayesian learning engine. Over here on the right-hand side, you have a button that you can click on or a link to perform Bayesian learning on demand at any time. And to help automate the process, you can enable automatic Bayesian learning, which will learn from messages based on their scoring threshold. So if you set these scoring values, say for example, legitimate message, you could put a low number here, like a 0.1. Those will all be considered as legitimate. And then the high number, a high scoring value, for example, those would be considered the spam messages. Security Gateway supports DNS block lists. These DNS block lists are lists of servers that are known to relay spam. And there are a variety of them out there that are well known in the industry. Spamhaus is one of them. It's probably the most popular one. With the options on the left-hand side, you'll check the box to enable DNS block list queries, and they can choose what to do with inbound messages that are sent from a server that is found to be on a DNS block list. You can accept the message and then tag the message subject with a series of characters, refuse the message, quarantine the message. So you've got options here. You can also configure exclusions, so messages from allow listed senders, for example, messages from authenticated sessions. And these are the DNS block lists that are included in Security Gateway. You can add additional ones as you see fit. You can reorder them. You can enable or disable them. So you've got lots of ways to control DNS block list settings. Notice, by the way, each DNS block list has its own scoring value as well. So for example, the top 5 actually are Spamhaus DNS block lists of different kinds. and each one has a scoring value of 12, except for the last one, which has a scoring value of 5. You can change these scoring values accordingly if you'd like to. Security Gateway also includes URI block lists, which are used to block or tag spam based on URLs that are contained within the message body. And again, you have similar options. You can refuse the message, quarantine the message that contains a bad URL or URI, or tag the message subject and let your mail server filter it accordingly. And of course, you can configure various exclusions, as you see over on the right-hand side. So messages from allow listed senders or authenticated sessions and so forth. And these are your URI block lists that are included with Security Gateway. And like I mentioned with the DNS block list, you can reorder them, you can add new ones. You've got a variety of options here. Now let's talk about Security Gateway's antivirus settings. Security Gateway comes with 2 antivirus engines, Icarus and Clam AV. And under the security menu, under the antivirus virus scanning menus, you can enable virus scanning using the options shown here, and then choose what to do when the antivirus engine determines that a message is infected. You can refuse the message, quarantine the message, you can quarantine messages that cannot be scanned, and of course you can configure exclusions, just like with other security settings. Also, if you scroll down on that same configuration screen, there's an option that says flag attachments with documents that contain macros as a virus. So this is useful because cybercriminals like to send Microsoft Office documents like Word, Excel as attachments to a phishing email, and then use social engineering to try to trick the recipient into enabling macros and then opening the attachment. The problem is, in many cases, when those macros are enabled, they can unleash malware on your network, which can cause all kinds of problems such as data breaches and loss of reputation. So this feature was added so that these Microsoft Office documents that have macros can be quarantined for administrative review before they are released to the end user. Now, as I mentioned, Security Gateway does have 2 antivirus engines, ClamAV and Icarus, and you can enable or disable either of the 2 using the checkboxes at the bottom. So this is what it looks like when a virus is detected in an email message. As you can see, there's a section titled Executing Antivirus, and the message was rejected because the message contained a particular virus file, and antivirus scanning terminated. Now let's talk about Security Gateway's anti-abuse settings. Security Gateway's dynamic screening feature can block connections exhibiting suspicious activity. For example, IP addresses or servers that connect too many times in a given time frame. IP addresses that cause too many failed RCPT attempts. RCPT basically means recipient. When an SMTP session is initiated and one mail server is sending mail to another mail server, it issues these RCPT commands to the receiving mail server indicating the email address of the recipient. So if it has a recipient command, say, in other words, an email address or a session that's addressed to an invalid user, that RCPT command will fail. This is indicative of, say, a spammer trying to send it to too many invalid recipients. They're just sending out junk to as many people as they can. And after a certain number of invalid recipients, dynamic screening can block that activity. Also, dynamic screening can block IP addresses that connect too many times in a given time frame, IP addresses that fail too many authentication attempts, and IP addresses that send too many reset commands to try to keep a session open while they try other ways to try to hack into your server. You can eliminate or block that type of activity as well. And then you can choose how long the session is blocked. Say, for example, 10 minutes, and then close the session after banning the IP address. You can also configure dynamic screening exclusions. So, for example, messages from allow listed IP addresses, messages from authenticated sessions, or messages from your domain mail servers, as shown here. Any servers or IP addresses that have been banned by dynamic screening will show on the bottom half of this window. So if dynamic screening banned an IP address by mistake, for example, as an administrator, you can go here and remove that IP address from the banned IP list. Security Gateway also includes account hijack detection. So let's say somebody manages to guess the password of one of your accounts, and they start sending out a lot of spam. Say, for example, too many messages in a given time frame. Hijack detection will detect that the account has been hijacked and disable the account after a given number of messages from an authenticated session are sent within a given period of time. And then the administrator can be notified so that they can take corrective action, such as changing the user's password, for example. Security Gateway includes location screening, which can be used to block connections or inbound emails from countries that you don't do business with. This also can have the added benefit of reducing a surprising amount of spam. And this is what it looks like in the log when a message is blocked by location screening. As you can see, it says executing location screening. It shows the connecting country, and then it shows the error message that it gives. Disconnect 530 access denied due to location screening policy. SecurityGateway also includes QR code detection. This is another popular tactic among spammers and cybercriminals. They will embed a QR code in an email, which can point to any URL that they specify, and then they can use some type of social engineering to try to get you to scan the QR code. So with QR code detection, SecurityGateway can send those messages to the administrative quarantine for review, or it can refuse the message, or it can tag the subject with a series of characters where you can let your mail server filter it accordingly. SecurityGateway includes a variety of anti-spoofing settings. As you can see, the options across the top of the interface here: reverse lookups, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and we'll talk about these throughout the next few slides here. So SecurityGateway can perform a reverse lookup on the inbound connection using the PTR record or using the domain that was passed in the mail from command. It will reach out to the server associated with that domain to see if the domain is valid. So for example, an email arrives from, say for example, example.org. SecurityGateway will do a DNS record lookup of the domain example.org and find the appropriate IP address used by that domain. If the IP address of that domain is not the same as the IP address of the server that sent the message, then we know the message is likely spoofed and the message can be rejected. SecurityGateway also includes a feature called Sender Policy Framework, or SPF, which is a mechanism that allows domain owners to specify what servers and gateways are allowed to send email from their domain. So the way it works is a domain owner publishes an SPF record to DNS, to the sending organization's DNS server. And then when an email is sent from that domain, the receiving server checks the SPF record of the domain and the from address to verify that the sending server is authorized to send on behalf of that domain. And then based on the SPF record, if the server that sent the message is not listed in the SPF record, then the message can be rejected. If the server is listed in the SPF record, then the message can be accepted. And under the anti-spoofing menu in SecurityGateway, these are the SPF verification settings that allow you to verify inbound messages against SPF. So you can see here, for example, when SPF processing returns a hard fail, you can refuse the message, or if it returns a soft fail, you can choose something different like quarantine the message. Soft fail might be, for example, if a message came from say for example, a subdomain, and the SPF record doesn't give clarity as to whether or not the sending server was authorized to send on behalf of that subdomain. There's another anti-spoofing tool called DKIM, Domain Keys Identified Mail, and it uses a pair of keys, a public key and a private key. Public key published to DNS and a private key that is used to sign all outbound messages from a particular domain. When the receiving server receives an email that is signed by DKIM, it uses that private key in the email and compares it with the public key in DNS based on the sending domain. So let's go into a little bit more detail on how this works. First, the sending organization publishes a DKIM public key to DNS, and then when an outbound message is sent from that sending organization, the mail server will be configured to sign the message with the private key. The receiving server sees that the message was signed with DKIM with a private key, and then reaches out to the sending domain's DNS server, checks the public DKIM record to see if the public key matches the private key that was found in the email message. And if they match, then the message can be accepted. If they don't match, the message can be rejected or quarantined. So for example, if I pull up my SecurityGateway, I can go here to Security, Anti-spoofing, DKIM signing. So this is on the outbound side. If I want to sign messages with DKIM with my SecurityGateway server, I can first check this box to sign outbound messages using Domain Keys Identified Mail, and then create a selector if I don't have one already. In this case, I've created one called example.com-DKIM, and then click on this button, View DNS Configuration, or the public key for this selector. So this information is everything that's published to my DNS records. This is what I use to sign all outbound messages from my domain, so that when a receiving server receives an email from me, they see that my messages have been signed by DKIM. They look up my public DKIM record based on the domain found in the DKIM key on the sending side, and they see if the public and private keys match. So Security Gateway can verify DKIM signatures on inbound messages, and when the public and private keys match for an inbound message, then Security Gateway can treat them with less scrutiny by lowering the message's overall score. So for example, adding a negative number, in this case -5, 5 points will be subtracted from the message's score for messages that pass DKIM verification. Now, as I mentioned, DKIM signing is used on the outbound side. So you'll check the box to sign outbound messages using DKIM, and then create your selector and view the DNS configuration, as I mentioned previously, that will be published to your DNS records. And again, this is what that DKIM selector looks like that you publish to DNS. Security Gateway also supports DMARC verification. DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. And it basically ties together both DKIM and SPF. It allows domain owners to tell receiving mail servers what to do with messages claiming to come from their domain that did not properly align with DKIM and SPF. So let's go into a little more detail on how this works. So first, the sending domain publishes a DMARC record to DNS. And then when an email is sent from that domain, the receiving server first checks the SPF record for alignment, then checks DKIM if the message was signed by DKIM to verify if the public and private keys match. Then it checks the sending domain's DMARC record to determine how to handle the message if it did not pass one or both SPF and DKIM verification. And based on the sending domain's DMARC record, the message can be accepted. The message can be rejected based on the DMARC policy. So for example, if my domain says, I want you to reject all messages that don't align with SPF and DKIM, then I'll have a reject policy where the receiving domain can reject the message. Or if the sending domain has a DMARC policy of quarantine, then the message can be quarantined. And an added benefit of DMARC is that sending domains can specify in their DMARC record an email address that is used to receive what we call forensic and aggregate reports, indicating how their domain is being used. So that's an added benefit of DMARC, is that domain owners can see if other servers are sending out mail claiming to come from their domain. And this allows them to secure their domain by ensuring that every device that is sending legitimately on behalf of their domain, say if it's a mail server, a mail gateway, another device connected, say an internet connected device that is legitimately sending mail for your domain, you can include those in your SPF record, for example. And if they're not included in your SPF record, then messages sent from them will fail SPF verification, and your DMARC reports will show you that so that you can correct those devices accordingly so that they are sending legitimately. So this is what a DMARC record looks like. Every DMARC record has the version number, or V equals, in this case DMARC 1, the policy, P equals reject. This can also be P equals quarantine or P equals none. There's an optional tag, a PCT equals or %. That is the percentage of messages that should be handled based on the policy. So when deploying DMARC, for example, you might have a policy of P equals none so that you can monitor your DMARC reports accordingly for a while until you are sure that all messages sent from your domain are properly signed with DKIM and SPF, regardless of which device sends them. And then you can change your policy from none to policy or P equals quarantine, and then continue to monitor these reports, and then P equals reject. And then you can use that percentage value and start with a low percentage and then move that percentage value up accordingly or increase it so that a higher percentage of messages are, say, for example, quarantined cumulatively as you continue to monitor your DMARC reports to ensure that all messages sent from your domain are legitimately DKIM signed, represented by a proper server authorized to send on behalf of your domain via the SPF record and so forth. The next tag, RUA, is where you want your aggregate reports to be sent. So you'll put a mail to command and then the email address that will be used to receive those reports. RUF is for forensic or failure reports. So if a message fails, DKIM or SPF, then the receiving server can send that failure report to whatever address you specify here. Below, you'll see a list of various different tags that are found in a DMARC record. There are others out there as well, which you can find at dmarc.org. And so this will help you understand the different tags in a DMARC record. Security Gateway can perform DMARC verification on inbound messages. And when DMARC verification returns a reject result, you can choose what to do with it, such as refuse the message, quarantine the message. Or if verification returns a quarantine result, you can choose what to do. Now, as I mentioned, domain owners can specify in their DMARC policy that P = tag whether they want receiving domains to quarantine or reject messages that don't properly align with SPF and DKIM. These settings allow you to override that P = tag in sending domains DMARC records. You can choose what to do with messages that don't properly align with SPF for external domains, refuse them or quarantine. And using the DMARC reporting settings, you can choose whether you wish to send DMARC aggregate and failure reports or forensic reports to domains that request them in their DMARC record. This is where you go to enable that feature. And within these DMARC reports that your server sends out, you can choose to include various types of metadata. Say, for example, contact information. If somebody receives a DMARC report from your domain that says a certain message did not pass DKIM or SPF or alignment was off for one of their messages or multiple messages that you receive from them, this allows them to get in touch with you to get more information as to why their message did not pass one verification method or the other, SPF or DKIM. That, in this case, for example, you could go through your message logs and pull up the SMTP transcript for a given message and give them a little bit more information as to why Security Gateway rejected their message based on your DMARC settings. This is what a DMARC report looks like. It shows the IP address of inbound messages that your server received, as well as the disposition, was the message quarantined or not, DKIM and SPF alignment, whether the message failed or passed DKIM and SPF alignment, the from header, the SPF domain, the SPF verification result, the DKIM domain, and the DKIM result. There's another feature called callback verification, which is another anti-spoofing method that can help determine if a message was sent from a valid server. So for example, let's say we have a user, John at example.com, who sends an email. The receiving server can do a DNS MX record lookup on the domain passed in the mail from, or the sender. The receiving server can then issue what we call a vrfy command to that mail server that was listed in the MX record for that sending domain to determine if that address actually exists on that sending mail server. And if it exists, if it's valid, then the messages accepted can be delivered to the end user. If, on the other hand, a spammer is spoofing that message, that domain, and you can do a callback verification lookup and then verify if that particular email address exists on the sending server. And if it's not valid, then the message can be rejected. And these are your callback verification settings in Security Gateway. They're again located under the Security Anti-Spoofing menu, where you can choose what to do with messages that failed callback verification, such as refuse the message, quarantine the message, or accept the message and tag the message subject, and so forth. Security Gateway also includes a feature called From Header Screening. This feature will modify the from header of incoming messages to cause the name-only portion of the header to contain both the name and the email address of the actual sender. So a lot of spammers will try to exploit the fact that many of us are checking our email on smaller screens or mobile devices that may only show what we call the display name or the friendly from name, for example, but it won't show the actual email address that the message came from. This also can happen if, say, a spammer forges the visible portion of the email address, while the actual email address in the message headers is the actual address the message came from. From header screening will take that actual email address that the message came from and place it into the visible portion to help alert the recipient if a message is being spoofed and they're trying to trick the recipient into thinking that the message came from somebody that it did not actually come from. Now let's talk about Security Gateway's other security settings. Security Gateway includes a content filter that allows you to perform a variety of filtering tasks based on conditions and actions. So for example, you can specify multiple conditions. You can look for keywords in the message subject or body, and you can filter based on a variety of other criteria, and then you can choose what action to take, such as send it as a secure message, reject the message, quarantine the message, and other actions as well. Security Gateway includes attachment filtering under the content filter. You can choose to block or quarantine certain types of attachments such as executables, image files, video files, and things like that. And if you scroll down on that same window, rather than having to enter the file extension individually for each type of attachment that you want to quarantine or block, you can click on the links to block all executable files, all image files, or say, for example, the recommended files that Security Gateway recommends blocking. Same thing with the quarantine side. You can quarantine images, movie files, audio files, compressed files, those types of things. Security Gateway includes block lists and allow lists. Now, if you'll notice, block lists, for example, can be entered based on their address, host name, or IP address. Now, these addresses can contain wildcards. So, for example, you can see that first entry I have is *@spamdomain.com. Right? So that's a wildcard indicating any address under the spamdomain.com domain. You can also include allow list entries, and again, these can contain addresses or host names as well as wildcards. If you hit the import button right here, you can import allow list and block list entries from a CSV file. Now, you only need one single CSV file to import all of your allow list and block list entries. And I'll have an example of what that looks like coming up here. But what you'll want to do is browse to the file that you would like to upload. I've got one here called sgwhitelistblocklist.csv. And then when you import it, it shows you how many of each item were imported. So 17 items in this case were imported. This is an example of what that CSV file looks like. So with one single CSV file, you can include all of your allow list and block list entries. These can be domain-wide or per user. They can include IP addresses, domain names, wildcards, any type. So one single CSV file can be used to populate all of those different allow list and block list configuration screens. And as you can see, for example, after I've imported that CSV file, if we go to the block list screen and if we go to the allow list screen, you can see that both screens were appropriately populated. Now, just because an entry is on an allow list doesn't mean that it's going to be allowed to be delivered regardless of any security settings. Throughout Security Gateway, you'll find various security features that have a setting that says exclude messages from allow listed senders from this particular security feature. For example, cryptographic or domain keys verification, antivirus outbreak protection settings. You can configure exclusions for messages coming from allow listed sending IP addresses. Security Gateway includes industry standard SSL and TLS for encrypted connections. Using the options on the left-hand side, you can enable SSL and TLS features, including Start TLS and SMTP TLS extensions, such as Require TLS and MTA STS or Strict Transport Security. You can create self-signed SSL TLS certificates using the options on at the bottom, and you can specify which certificates are active, which ones are default. You can create additional ones. You can use Let's Encrypt to automate the process of creating new SSL and TLS certificates. You can also import third-party certificates, say for example from GoDaddy or another certificate authority. Now, if you choose to use a third-party certificate, then we do have a knowledge base article that will walk you through the steps for importing and installing a third-party SSL or TLS certificate. And then moving further down on that same screen, you can configure Start TLS exemptions. Those are connections from certain domains or hosts that will not use or cannot use Start TLS, or encrypted connections in this case. And on the right-hand side, you have a Start TLS required list for connections to hosts or IPs on the list that must use Start TLS to encrypt the connection. Security Gateway supports SMTP authentication, and by default, the box is checked for authentication to always be required when mail is from a local account. Of course, you can configure various exclusions, say for example from a domain mail server or from allow listed IP addresses or hosts. And you can require SMTP authentication for common email addresses such as the postmaster, abuse, webmaster, things like that. Security Gateway has a feature called IP shielding, which states that messages from domains on the IP shield must have been sent from a designated IP address or range of IP addresses. This is useful for devices that cannot use proper SMTP authentication. It provides an additional way to authenticate. And of course, as I mentioned with previous security features, you can configure exclusions, as you can see over here on the right-hand side. Security Gateway includes a secure messaging portal that stores messages on the server and sends a link to the message recipient to log into the messaging portal, the secure messaging portal, to read their messages. Those messages, because they are stored on the Security Gateway server and the recipient logs into a browser-based portal, those messages can be read over an encrypted HTTPS connection. So those messages never actually leave the Security Gateway server. And this helps ensure that the message cannot be intercepted or tampered with because the connection is encrypted and the message is not actually transmitted to another server. So the way it works is we first enable the secure messaging portal using the option shown here on the configuration screen. Then we need to determine which recipients are allowed to receive secure messages. So these recipients are added under the recipients screen. You can click on the new button to add your new secure messaging recipient. And then you can specify what options are available to secure messaging recipients. Can they modify their own password? Because a secure messaging recipient, they're given a login and password to log into the secure messaging portal. This allows them to modify their password. This will allow them to display the show password icon. They can enable two-factor authentication and various other settings, as you can see here. Secure messaging recipient options include the option to check passwords against a compromised password list from a third-party service. With this option, you can prevent users from using any password that's been found in a data breach. That's going to include many common passwords like password1 and let me in and any variations of those, but also a variety of other passwords that have been found in a data breach. And there are many, many thousands of them. And because secure messaging recipients can also be created automatically, the global administrator can be notified when a secure messaging recipient is created. You can also, using the options on the right-hand side, require that secure messaging recipients agree to a terms of use policy before they are allowed to use the secure messaging portal. And using the message composition options, secure messaging recipients can optionally compose new messages to specified local users, which you select here. Now, Security Gateway determines whether a message should be sent via the secure messaging portal using rules. They can be content filter rules, data leak prevention rules, or sieve scripts. For example, if we create a content filtering rule that looks for the word confidential in the message subject, for example, then you can choose under the actions pop-up menu as you see here, send as secure web message. This is what the secure messaging portal looks like when a user logs into it. As you can see, all of their secure messages are listed here. And again, they log into it using their browser. And then they can read the message and optionally reply accordingly. So here's what it looks like when they read their secure message. And then when they hit the reply button, they can compose a reply to the original sender. Security Gateway includes data leak prevention to help prevent confidential data from being sent via email. Data leak prevention rules can look for credit card numbers, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, and a variety of other identifying details for a variety of countries. So whether you're in Australia, Japan, any other country, or most major countries, chances are there is a rule or a variety of rules that correspond to sensitive content that could be transmitted that's related to your country. You can also create your own data leak prevention rules. And when a data leak prevention rule is created or enabled, you can modify that rule. You can see what action is taken when confidential data is found. You can send it to the administrative quarantine, or you can choose a different action such as sending it as a secure web message, which, like I mentioned previously, would use the secure messaging portal. Another feature of Security Gateway's data leak prevention is the ability to check for medical terms. And the way this works is Security Gateway has a listing of medical terms, and you can add additional ones accordingly. Each term is assigned a scoring value. And then after a given number of points are tallied up in a message, once a particular scoring threshold has been met, then the message can be placed in the administrative quarantine, sent via the secure messaging portal, or sent using required TLS, which will use end-to-end encryption. Here is a list of the medical terms that Security Gateway looks for. You can enable various different rules to look for various different terms. As you can see, each one has a scoring value. Most of the ones visible here have a scoring value of 10, but you can modify these scoring values accordingly by selecting a rule and clicking on the Edit button at the top of the window here. Here's an example of what you'll see if SecurityGateway receives an outbound message that contains a medical term. Right, so this is my message log. As you can see on the far left-hand side, the blue and green envelopes with up and down arrows. The blue ones with an up arrow indicate an outbound message. The green ones with the down-facing arrow indicate an inbound message. And with each one, you can see the result of the message delivery. Was it rejected? Was it delivered? And so forth. In this particular case, we see that the message requires review. It was replaced into administrative quarantine because a medical term was found. Let's talk about some administration features in SecurityGateway. SecurityGateway includes per domain user and message size limits. So under the Setup Users menu, if we go to Accounts, and then we select a particular domain and click on the Edit button, you'll see on the domain properties on the right-hand side, you can limit the maximum number of users on a per domain basis. You can place a maximum message size for messages for that particular domain. You can also add any domain aliases accordingly as shown here. Each domain can be assigned its own mail servers, or if a mail server has not been assigned for a particular domain, then the default mail server will be used if you have assigned a default mail server. Each domain can also have its own administrators. So for example, I have a administrator of john.smith@example.com who can log into SecurityGateway and do administrative tasks corresponding specifically to that domain. So domain administrators will not have access to global administrator settings. Global administrators, for example, can access civ scripts, data leak prevention rules, things like that. Domain administrators cannot access those global settings, but they can access domain-specific settings for their particular domain. SecurityGateway supports custom per domain branding. So if you'd like to upload your company logo for your domain, which is displayed in the SecurityGateway interface, you can do that here. And under the Setup Users Accounts menu, if you go to User Options, you can specify what options are allowed or not allowed for your users. For example, if you want to allow users to modify their own password, if you want to allow them to view and manage their own quarantine folders or modify their own quarantine settings. As an administrator, you might not want users to be allowed to change their quarantine settings. So if you wanted to, you could go in here and you could uncheck this checkbox, for example. You could allow users to view a log of messages addressed to or from their account. So this allows them to view the message log. You can require that users enable two-factor authentication before they are allowed to log into SecurityGateway. You can also enter administrative contact information, which is displayed on the sign-in screen to allow users to receive sign-in help as needed. Under Mail Configuration, Mail Delivery, you can choose whether to send all outbound mail directly to the receiving mail server, or if you want to send outbound through another smart host, you have the option to do so using the options on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you have Retry Queue Configuration Settings. This allows you to specify how often to retry delivery of mail during the first hour if it could not be delivered immediately. And then SecurityGateway will continue to try to redeliver that message at regular intervals, but after a given period of time, after the first hour, for example, SecurityGateway will retry delivery at less frequent intervals, say, for example, every 240 minutes or 480 minutes or so forth. And then after a given period of days, SecurityGateway will stop trying to deliver the message if it could not deliver the message in that particular time frame. Under the Email Protocol Configuration screen, this is where you can go to specify your port settings that SecurityGateway listens on for SMTP traffic, SSL, SMTP connections, the MSA or Message Submission Agent port, other protocol settings on the right-hand side, such as allowing a certain number of reset commands, message size limits, those types of things. SecurityGateway has different mail queues. There's a user quarantine, an administrative quarantine, messages that are queued for delivery, and a bad messages queue. So the user quarantine, which you see here, these are going to be messages that were quarantined by the spam filter and other security features. Users can log into SecurityGateway if you grant them permission to do so via the user options screen that we just showed previously. And then those users can choose to release the message from quarantine accordingly, mark it as spam or non-spam, those types of things. The administrative quarantine will contain messages that require administrative review. These might be messages with a questionable attachment, sensitive data, say data leak prevention, those types of things. So as an administrator, you can review the administrative quarantine and optionally delete the message, release the message from quarantine, mark a message as spam or non-spam, which feeds the message to the Bayesian learning engine. Also, by the way, you can select a message and select the allow list or block list options in the upper right-hand corner as well. And as with every one of these message log screens, by the way, there's a button here where it says Show Search, where you can perform an advanced search so you can find exactly what you're looking for. The queued for delivery queue is going to contain messages that have not yet been delivered, but Security Gateway is in the process of delivering them. You'll see those here. And then any messages that could not be delivered in a given period of time, or messages that were sent to the bad queue via content filtering rules or for whatever reason, will show up in the bad messages queue. Messages that could not be delivered after a given period of time. Security Gateway includes built-in archiving at no extra cost. You can enable that feature under the Setup Users Archiving menu. On the right-hand side, you can use the options shown here to configure automatic archive store creation and to manually manage Security Gateway's archive stores. Here is a list of archive stores that I have on my test server. You can see here, for example, if an archive store is enabled, which allows searches to be performed in that archive, and if the status of the archive is active, and that is where messages are actively being archived. And within Security Gateway's archiving feature, you'll find compliance settings. So for example, data retention settings, retain archived messages for a minimum of, say, for example, 7 days. Automatic deletion of archived messages after a given period of time. You can also enable legal hold if you need to do so to prevent messages from being removed from the archive. And if you have messages archived for a particular user that should not have been archived and you want to no longer archive future messages for that particular user, you can use the forget contact feature at the bottom to remove all archived messages for a specific address. Security Gateway stores various different types of data in different directories. So for example, messaging data, your message logs, SMTP transcripts, attachments, plain text logs, as well as the location of your inbound queue, your civ executables, and a temp queue. Now, this is useful if you wanted to help improve Security Gateway's performance. You could offload certain types of data to a different hard drive or different physical drive. Say, for example, if you map a drive letter to another drive and you put your logs on that drive, or you put your inbound queue on that drive, that way you have multiple drives working together, and this can help improve Security Gateway's performance. Security Gateway includes disk space monitoring, which can help prevent issues caused by your hard drive filling up. When you enable the disk space checking engine, the global administrator can be warned or sent a warning if your free disk space falls below a certain threshold, say for example 1000 megabytes or 1 gigabyte. And if free disk space falls even further, you can disable SMTP engine services altogether so that you don't encounter any more severe issues with your disk running out of space. You can configure data retention settings in Security Gateway. Message database records are used to populate the charts and graphs in Security Gateway. And if you don't need charts and graphs representing a certain period of data beyond a certain time frame in the past, you can delete those database records, say for example after 7 days, 30 days, whatever you'd like to do, however you'd like to configure that. And you can choose what to do with message transcripts. So transcripts will contain SMTP delivery information. You can choose to delete those after a given period of time, or you can choose to process message transcripts with the corresponding message database records. These settings are helpful to help keep your database at a manageable size. You can also choose to delete bandwidth information after a given period of time, and you can also choose under the message content section what types of data to not delete. So for example, do not delete message content after a successful delivery. Do not delete message content when a message is rejected. A lot of times if a message is rejected, many administrators will determine that they don't necessarily need access to the content itself as long as they have access to the SMTP transcripts. But if you want to keep that type of data, you can choose not to delete those types of data in the message content. You can also configure database logging exclusions, so these can help reduce the database size, but they may also include helpful message delivery status information. However, if you choose not to log dynamic screening data, invalid recipient information, invalid sender, mail lookup data, things like that, you can still navigate to the plain text logs, which we'll talk about shortly, to find that information. Security Gateway can be configured to automatically back up its database at regular intervals. Now again, the database is used to populate all the charts and graphs as well as the message transcripts and things like that. You can choose to automatically back up the entire database at regular intervals. And you can also choose to automatically back up archive stores at regular intervals. You can choose to automatically back up essential data only. And then with these automated backups, by the way, if you needed to restore your database, which I'll talk about in an upcoming screen, you can choose a backed up database file to restore that database to Security Gateway. Also useful, by the way, if you needed to move Security Gateway to another server, you'll want to make sure you back up your database first so that when you move Security Gateway to another server, you can restore that database file to the new server. Also, further down on the screen, you have manual backup options where you can export all allow list and block list entries to a CSV file on demand. You can back up your configuration data at regular intervals. You can back up your entire database on demand. You can back up your archive stores on demand. And we have a knowledge base article on our website at mdamon.com, which you'll see a link at the bottom that talks about these backup settings in more detail and how to back up Security Gateway. Now, to restore your database from a backup file, first you'll want to upload the backup file using the button on the top, browse to it, and then use the upload button. After you've uploaded the backup file, it will show in the list which you see at the bottom. So option number 2, step number 2, select the backup file that you want to restore. And then using step number 3, click on the restore button to restore from your backup file. Security Gateway includes quarantine options under the Setup Users Mail Configuration Quarantine Configuration menu. You can choose to hold quarantine messages on the server and then optionally send users an email listing the contents of their quarantine at regular intervals, say every 1 hour, every 4 hours. Or you can allow the mail server or client to filter quarantine messages and then optionally tag the message subject with a series of characters or add a special header that allows the mail server content filter, for example, to filter those messages accordingly. And then you have different options that you can select, such as allowing the recipient to view quarantine messages directly from the quarantine email. You can choose to include the always allow or allow list option in the quarantine list, or include the block list option in the quarantine list, or the block list domain option. Now, as an administrator, if you don't want your users to inadvertently add a spammer to the allow list, for example, you can uncheck the second option there, include always allow in quarantine list and email. These are your plain text log files under the logging menu under log files. So if you don't see what you're looking for in the message transcripts or the color-coded message logs, you can go to the plain text log files and find message delivery activity here. So your inbound log, your outbound log, routing logs, those types of things. You can find all that information here. By the way, you have, for example, your system log, which shows you system-wide information such as Security Gateway starting and stopping, CLAM AV updates right here, your CLAM AV update log, a change log right here if any changes are made, your Bayesian learning log, failed authentication log right here. So it's useful to become familiar with these log files, especially if, say, for example, the failed auth log, if somebody's trying to guess passwords and you want to see when authentication has failed, you can use the failed auth log to do that. This is an example of what the user quarantine report looks like that is sent to your end users. As you can see, it shows the sender, the recipient, the date, with links on the right-hand side, such as releasing the message from quarantine, always allow, which will allow list or whitelist the sender, confirm the message as spam, block list the sender, block list the sender's domain. Now, like I mentioned, as an administrator, you can choose whether or not the recipient sees the block list option, for example, or the allow list option, right? So you have control over that as an administrator. This is what the administrative quarantine looks like. Again, this will be messages that contain, say, sensitive data that were filtered out by data leak prevention, messages that were filtered by the content filter, and those types of things. You'll see that information here. Messages that might contain a questionable attachment, for example. Security Gateway includes Civ scripts, which all of Security Gateway's security features are based on Civ scripts. You can move these Civ scripts up and down and change the order in which they're used. You can create your own. Let me show you on my test server a real example of that. So if we go to the security menu and we go to Civ scripts right here, these are all based on the particular step in the SMTP delivery process, the IP step, the HLO step, the authentication step, the mail or mail from, RCPT or recipient or RCPT2, and you can move these steps up and down accordingly. This is what we call defense layer customization, where you can change the order in which Security Gateway processes various different security features. You can hover your mouse over any one of these to see the actual CIV script corresponding to that particular feature. And right here, you can click on the new button to add your own CIV scripts. Right here, you'd simply put in the script text and then save your new script. So CIV scripts are useful for, say, if you're a power user and you want to apply some highly tailored custom filtering to your server that corresponds to your specific industry, for example. CIV scripts can be useful for that. So now let's talk about Security Gateway's logging and reporting options. This is the message log in Security Gateway. As I mentioned, it shows you if a message is inbound or outbound, the sender, recipient, the message subject, the delivery result. Was it delivered? Does it require review? Was it rejected? Was it quarantined? And if so, the reason why. Attachment filtering, data leak prevention, callback verification. And you can perform an advanced search on your message log. You can search for recipient, sender, result. And then when you click on a message, you can review the message transcript, right? So you can see, for example, that this message failed demarking. Everything is nicely color-coded for you. Let me go back to my live server so I can show you what this looks like in a real-world example. So if I go to Messages Queues, I go to All Messages. These are all my inbound and outbound messages on my test server here. And as you can see, for example, here's one that was sent as a secure web message. So this was using the secure messaging portal. This one requires review due to data leak prevention. If I double click on it, I can scroll down. I can see, for example, the inbound and outbound SMTP commands right here. And if we scroll down to data leak prevention, first you can see where the message is passing through Spam Assassin. Spam Assassin scanning terminated. And then you can see where the word confidential was found in the message subject, and it was filed into the administrative quarantine. So that was the data leak prevention rule that was triggered to send it to the administrative quarantine. So this makes troubleshooting email delivery issues easy. You can configure various logging options in Security Gateway. The log level allows you to specify how detailed you want logging information to be that's written to the Security Gateway logs. Now, I would recommend that we leave it set to informational. However, if you needed to troubleshoot a mail delivery issue that you cannot resolve by reviewing your standard logs, or if you needed to reach out to our support staff for some advanced troubleshooting, you might need to enable debug logging, or our support staff might ask you to enable debug logging, which you can do here to do advanced troubleshooting as needed. You can configure a log mode, such as a standard set of logs, or create a new set of logs every day. And using the log maintenance options on the right-hand side, you can specify a log file size limit to keep your logs at a manageable size. And as I mentioned, under reports, your reports have clickable data points that allow you to view traffic corresponding to that particular data point. As you can see, this report is laid out by the hour. So with every hour, there's a new data point that's added, where if you click on that data point, it takes you to the messages corresponding to that data point. For example, here's your junk email breakdown showing the different types of junk email. We have a report on the top email senders, for example, and a variety of other reports as well. As I mentioned, you can also create custom reports. So that should provide a good summary of Security Gateway. As I mentioned, Security Gateway can be used to protect any type of mail server from inbound and outbound threats. And if you'd like to learn more about Security Gateway, you can visit our website at mdamon.com, and you can download a fully functional 30-day free trial from our website. If you have questions or comments, you can leave a comment in the comment section below, or if you need support, we have support options as well on our website.